Welcome to the Probate Nation. Probate is a process to settle the financial affairs of a deceased person and then transfer the remaining probate assets to the beneficiaries. Not all assets are probate assets, and there are different types of probate, some simple, others more complicated. Like a journey on a slow-moving steam engine train, probate has a beginning and several stops along the way. At the end of the trip, the balance of the probate assets are delivered to the decedent's beneficiaries. One of the most challenging parts of probating an estate is dealing with the personal property that the decedent accumulated. Dishes, furniture, silverware, pictures, power tools, and so much more, scattered throughout his residence, has to be dealt with in some fashion. Do you sell it, give it to charity, haul it to a dump site, or divide it among the family beneficiaries? Certainly, valuing the personal property can be helpful in answering those questions, and it can be especially helpful in dividing that property equitably among the family during an emotional time. In our show today, a professional appraiser of personal property will share with us who is competent to provide that valuation, how the valuation process unfolds, how values are determined, how the appraiser is paid, and much more. Our guest has worked in the art and antiques field for over 15 years and is the owner of Artifactual History Appraisal, a personal property appraisal firm. She is an accredited member of the Appraisers Association of America, an accredited member of the International Society of Appraisers, and a graduate of NYU Program in Appraisal Studies in Fine and Decorative Arts. She received her master's and undergraduate degrees from the College of William & Mary, and her prior professional experience includes positions at the Smithsonian Institute, the Library of Congress, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, and as a subject specialist at auction houses. Please welcome Sarah Reeder. Hi, Sarah.
Hello. Thanks for having me here today.
Oh my gosh, thank you for coming. Boy, you are so qualified. You really have so much education and experience. I'm really excited about what you can share with our viewers, because this is a very, very difficult issue, even though it may not involve a lot of money sometimes. So let's start with, what tangible property is typically going to be appraised?
Some of the types of tangible personal property that are regularly appraised are household items, furniture, and this includes both antiques and non-antiques. There's a lot of confusion about that, and antiques are generally classified as things that are over 100 years old, but sometimes things that are younger than that can still be quite valuable, such as certain mid-century modern furniture items. Other things that are typically appraised include jewelry, paintings and other fine art, Oriental rugs, and then other items such as sterling silver. There's a lot of confusion between sterling silver and silver plate, so that's something that an appraiser can be very helpful in determining which is which. And rare books, decorative arts like ceramics, and specialty collections like coins and luxury handbags and designer clothing as well.
Okay, that's a lot of stuff. Not all that typically is in everybody's house, so that's the list of everything that could be out there, but I think what are some of the purposes behind appraising tangible personal property, though? Why do we do this?
Sure. Each appraisal assignment depends on the specific legal needs, and so that's one reason why I always recommend that my clients go first and check with their lawyer to find out precisely what they need, because that saves everybody time and money. Some of the reasons are for insurance. Often, increasingly, I'm getting a lot of inquiries for people who are looking to have equitable distribution among family members, making sure that discord in the family is avoided. So that's why it's great to have an appraiser who is an impartial, independent third party with that subject knowledge come in to be able to help resolve that. Some other reasons are for charitable contribution purposes, estate tax purposes, and then also for just people like to know what they have for a planned future sale or downsizing.
Sure. Well, that's good news. Now let's talk about the actual person that does the appraiser, because it can't just be anybody down the street who comes in and places a value. So who can actually be an appraiser?
Sure. There is no formal licensure process for appraisers to be trained, but it's really strongly recommended for clients to seek out an appraiser who is what is called USPAP compliant. And USPAP are the standards, the quality control standards, you might say, for appraisers. And they regulate the ethical situations that appraisers can, must comply with in those situations.
Okay. Now, do appraisers have to pass a certain test in order to be licensed in some way?
Yes, yes. Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice is
Okay.
called in the field USPAP. We always
USPAP.
say
I know
USPAP.
you use that acronym. I wasn't quite
Yes.
sure what that was for.
So that stands for Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice, and there is
Okay.
an exam. In order to be what is called USPAP compliant as an appraiser, you have to take a 15-hour course that goes through all of the material, and it's a very long book of all the things you cannot do in an appraisal. And then you take and you have to pass an exam on that material where you apply the knowledge in certain hypothetical situations. Once you have accomplished that, and it's quite difficult to do that, then you're called USPAP compliant.
Okay, very good. So then these are the standards that appraisers would follow, and if once you're USAP
compliant, yes.
you then follow those standards in going ahead and rendering an appraisal opinion. Is that what you do?
Exactly. There are a lot of legal requirements. For example, I have to keep my client work files for a minimum of 5 years.
Okay, so good for us to remember as we go along the course that we want to focus on, is somebody USAP compliant?
Yes.
Okay, so, and those standards are basically established, these are the standards that come from USAP as far as how you do your appraisal.
They're the
and-
federally recognized standards, and this applies to real estate appraisers, business appraisers, and personal property appraisers.
So people can be USAP compliant, but in certain specialized areas too.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So we may need someone to do fine art versus someone to do jewelry versus someone to do just personal property or real estate.
It's an overlay that applies to all fields of appraising, and then within that, say someone can be a jewelry appraiser, and then that falls under what's called the competency rule of USPAP, that you have to be competent in this area that you're appraising. And so if I, for example, don't appraise jewelry in my firm because I don't have the years of specialized gemological training to be called competent under USPAP. So
I see.
I appraise art and antiques, but not jewelry.
Okay, well again, that's good to know as we go along here. So the purpose behind USPAP?
It is to promote and maintain the public trust in appraisers and appraisal services.
Okay, so we just don't want some guy pulling up in his station wagon and pulling out some papers and writing down a number for you.
Which did happen in years before USPAP.
Okay, no complaint about anybody driving a station wagon, of course. And so are these standards that you are following, are they updated periodically, or are they set in stone and they haven't changed for years?
They are updated every 2 years, and the basic tenets, which really boil down to don't be unethical, those don't really change, but little bits change every 2 years. And so appraisers have to take an update class, which is 7 hours every 2 years, to maintain their USPAP compliancy. And if they lapse on that or miss it, then they have to start all over at the beginning with the 15-hour update and exam.
Well, we don't want to have to start over. So
No, no, I always schedule those updates.
Now, can anybody be a USPAP member?
You have to meet those requirements that I mentioned above, and so while technically that would be open to anyone if they can meet those requirements, it really, you have to pass the exam. It's very carefully proctored, and it's something that's well regulated by the government.
Okay. Now, in addition to being a USPAP member and having that membership, then are there any other professional organizations that people normally belong to?
Yes, in America there are 3 main organizations,
Okay.
and those are called the ISA, which stands for International Society of Appraisers, the ASA, the American Society of Appraisers, and the AAA, which in this instance doesn't stand for the cars, but it stands for Appraisers Association of America.
Okay. So do people, they've already become USPAP compliant and they would join those organizations. Is that a condition to join those organizations?
It is. All 3 of them have stringent requirements, both to first initially join, and then they have a lot of continuing education requirements to retain their membership. But one thing that is common among all of them is you have to be USPAP compliant to join.
Okay, so getting that compliance certificate is really the key to getting through that
Exactly.
doorway. Got it. Well, let's talk about the appraisal process. Let's just begin. Can you appraise personal property over the phone?
No, I can't. Often I can be helpful to a client over the phone, providing general feedbacks and suggestions as to their specific situation, but it's really important to remember that that is not an appraisal.
Okay. Now, can you appraise personal property by looking at it via the computer? We have all these technology keys now that you could show different things and see things remotely.
In some situations that is possible. It's not ideal, but the key thing is that it is mentioned in the scope of work of the appraisal report as what's called a limiting condition, that the appraiser was working from photographs and never saw the work in person.
Okay.
It's best to look at everything in person because often there are things that you can only see on site that are important details, but in some situations you really can't. Just like for an insurance damage claim where the original object has been destroyed and you only have a picture of it before the damage.
Okay, that would be an example where it might work. Well, what is the process that professionals would follow to do a normal appraisal?
Sure. The first thing is that I talk to the client. People reach out to me either by email or by phone, and I go through with them about what exactly they need. And that's something where there's not a lot of good information for people to realize what they need. So initially I spend a lot of time figuring out what they need in their situation, which goes back to I always encourage clients to check first with their lawyer or their accountant and make sure, especially if it's for legal use, that they know precisely what is needed, because that's going to save us all a lot of time.
Okay.
Then once we determine whether it's something that they really do need an appraisal, and not all situations need an appraisal, but if an appraisal is needed, then I schedule an appointment. I go out on site, I take a look at the items, I photograph them, I document them, measure them, get all of my information. I like to work room by room, so particularly for family members, they can help them remember, oh, this was in the living room, and it's a visual cue. And then back in my office, there's quite a bit of research that I have to put in on my side, where I go through and do my valuation research and analysis and write the report to send to them.
Okay, so let's talk about the on-site visit and what actually takes place. I think you kind of jumped into that a little bit, which is good. So again, refresh me again, why is an on-site visit really necessary?
Sure. It's ideal. It doesn't always happen if the conditions are such that it's impossible, but what is really important is that the appraiser has the opportunity to examine the items in person, take a look at the condition. Sometimes for certain objects like a painting, condition can make a huge difference in value, and that doesn't always show up in a picture. So it's best if you can take a look in person, and it also helps verify that the things really are there.
Technology is a beautiful thing, but it can be manipulated.
Yes.
Correct. So you mentioned that typically when you do an on-site visit, what do you normally go room by room?
Yes, I like to go room by room, and then, so I'll say living room, and then not everything in a house is often appraised. Frequently, I'm called in to appraise only the highest value items or certain items that were specified to be distributed in a will. So for the items in a room that are part of what needs to be appraised, then I will document each one, photograph it, take detailed shots of the artist's signature, areas of damage, things like that are important for the valuation that I'll include in the report.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the research and write-up, because that's really, now you have the grist for the mill, but now you need to do some grinding.
Exactly.
So what resources do you use in order to establish value?
Sure. I use multiple databases that aggregate auction records. I tend to have about 5 tabs up at once, and I'll just go through all of them for each piece, because the databases all aggregate slightly different groups of auction houses. So I like to use a number of them so I can be more comprehensive. That is for my fair market value reports, how I do most of my comparables. And then I also use different databases and galleries that are on the retail side of the market for insurance appraisal reports.
Okay. Now, do you test these values that you come up with?
Yes. There's a lot of economic analysis that goes into generating an appraisal report, and that's one of the things that isn't widely known about the appraisal field. You think it's like on TV where it's, here's the number and that's that, but it's for each comparable, I test it. I look at where was this sold, when was it sold, what condition was it in, how well was it cataloged, how similar is it to my appraised item that I'm researching. Is there something about the provenance that would add value, like it used to belong to a celebrity? And then for all of those factors, I compare it to the appraised item and then make adjustments up or down as appropriate. And I try not to use a single comparable either for each item. So for each appraised item, there are usually several comparables that I have done that analysis for and compared. And then I aggregate that into the appraised value.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
Now, can anybody look at these auction house databases that you mentioned?
A lot of them are subscription-based, and they have a paid subscription, but a number of them are free with an email address if you set up an account. One that I think your viewers might find of use is Live Auctioneers. That has it's for auction records, and it has a pretty broad range of sales, and that's free with an email address. So it can help people get a general sense if the items they have are worth appraising.
Okay. Now, how long does it typically take to do your research and value tangible property, personal property?
It depends on each assignment and how many items are included, but on-site, it usually takes about several hours for me to do the on-site appointment with my photography and documentation, and then back in the office, it's definitely several more hours as well.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of work. Now, you mentioned now you don't necessarily value everything in the house.
Yes.
So some things just are I mean, mom or dad's favorite rocking chair, may or may not be an antique and may not really merit much valuation work.
That's exactly it. It's always, there's that separate filter of determining with the client, is this something that's going to be worth them having it appraised? And often, sometimes when I'm in the house, I can say, I don't think this is going to be in your best interest to include it. And that can help resolve some disputes among family members as well.
And do you find when you're at the house that you identify some things that they didn't realize were valuable?
Yes, yes. I love it when that happens. It's not
That's
all the
gotta be
time.
Really nice.
It's pretty rare, but I've had it happen, and it's wonderful.
I'll bet. Well, let's talk a little bit. Obviously, time is money.
Yes.
And it sounds like you're going to be spending a lot of time, if you're depending on the nature of the engagement, but certainly visiting and then the research that follows seems to be very time intensive. So how do appraisers charge for their service?
Appraisers charge a number of different ways. Some charge hourly with an hourly rate depending on how many hours are in the assignment. Some give a flat project rate. And then others, this is something that your viewers should really be aware of, there's also a thing called a prohibited contingent fee, and that is not allowed under USPAP, and that is where there's the appraiser has a conflict of interest, where, say, for example, an appraiser says, my fee will be 10% of whatever the appraised value is. Do not do that. You cannot do that. And it did happen quite a bit before USPAP, so that's something that your viewers should be very aware of and not enter into a contract with an appraiser who charges on a contingent fee.
When did USPAP actually come into the...
It originally came into being in the 80s as a result of the savings and loan crisis.
Okay.
And it started out for real estate appraisers, and then gradually over the years it subsumed all the appraisal fields. But that's a good thing.
It's been around for a little bit then. Now, do appraisers typically sell the personal property that they are appraising, even if they're charging on an hourly basis?
I do not. Some appraisers do go about this differently, and they have wear different hats, as they call it. It's a really tricky area and something that I personally don't engage in, and it's really important for consumers of appraisal services to be cautious about this and make sure that their needs are going to be well represented.
Okay, but it's not necessarily prohibited under USPAP.
It's not prohibited, but you have to proceed very cautiously to make sure that you're not having a USPAP violation.
Okay, well, let's talk about very quickly some red flags that people should be aware of when they're talking with someone they might be considering hiring as an appraiser, things that should send off some warning bells. What are some of those things? Sure.
Well, the first is the prohibited contingent fee. Another thing to watch out for is really to ask the question, does the appraiser have the background in my type of items? Like, for example, I mentioned earlier, I don't appraise jewelry. I like jewelry, I don't appraise jewelry because I don't have the background to have that specialized gemological knowledge.
Okay.
Some firms do have a number of different appraisers on staff, so they can be full service in this way, where they have a gemologist, they have a fine art appraiser, and so that that's a good question to ask, and it's not unheard of, but most appraisers specialize in one side of the field rather than both. So it's art and antiques rather than jewelry, or vice versa. So it's really, you make sure that the items you have, you're matching up with an appraiser who has the appropriate background for that.
And of course, I gather that we would like to have an appraiser who's USPAP
compliant.
So
Definitely, that's a must.
That would be a good entry question. Let's talk about common appraisal problems. What are some of the common problems that you see in appraisals?
Sure. I've noticed recently there's been a big increase in companies offering what you might call robo-appraisals, where it's a very short turnaround time, very low price point, and for the general public, it's hard to determine why this would be problematic. It seems like a good deal, but a lot of these appraisals, if you can call them that, aren't USPAP compliant. They don't incorporate that specialized methodology, and most of them aren't going to be accepted by your insurance company or the government.
Okay. How about TV evaluations? We see these TV shows where someone, appraises something. They walk into this store, that store, and next thing you know, 5 minutes later, after a couple of commercials, we have an appraisal.
Those TV shows are really good entertainment, and they're really fun to watch, and for the general public, they're a great way to learn more about art and antiques. But the thing that is so critical to remember is that they only turn the camera on for the really fun part at the end, and they leave out all of the research and preparation that went into that last part. So while it's really fun to watch, it's important to remember it's TV. Okay.
And we are on TV.
Yes, yes.
There's a lot of research that went into this program.
Yes, there is.
Now, Do we run into a problem as well that the property that's being appraised may not be what people think it is?
This happens all the time, and I hate it when it happens. Often through family history or through what someone's been told, usually by the person they bought it from. They have something in mind about what an item is, and I have to be the person to give them the bad news, and that's never fun. And but at least knowledge is power, and also the other things that there are a huge amount of fakes and forgeries out there now. So as an appraiser, I have to be really cautious about that and be aware of when they pop up.
Okay. How about, what is the effective date that people generally want the appraisal done? Because you walk in, sometimes it could be 6 months after someone's passed away.
Exactly, and this is something I spend vast amounts of time trying to explain to clients, so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to have it here on film. The effective date of an appraisal report is it pins down the value in time. So the effective date usually might not be the day that you're there. Especially in an estate situation, it usually is the date of death. So that's back to call your lawyer, find out when the effective date is, the very first thing to do, because otherwise your appraiser may do an entire report with the wrong effective date, and all the values are going to be different because they're pinning that value down at a different moment in time. So I always, from the beginning, what is the effective date? Is that what your lawyer says the effective date is? And it's usually date of death for estate. For insurance, it's usually the date that I'm there inspecting the item because it's the condition of the item on that day that I'm looking at it. It varies depending on what the intended use is of the appraisal report. And the thing that's really important about effective date from my side of the research is that I don't include comparables that fall outside of that effective date. So if something's sold after the effective date, I can't include that in my valuation research and analysis.
So one of the things that we focused on, I know we're running a little bit short of time, is sometimes we may need the appraisal for date of death, but we're also now going to be distributing this stuff. And so we may need to have a more current date.
Exactly.
Do you find yourself doing both of those?
It's complicated, and I do that, yes. It's more work for me, but it's something that will suit the needs of the family. And
sure.
Values can change dramatically over time, especially depending if it's been quite a bit of time. So that's always something for clients to keep in mind, that what it was when they purchased it and what it was and whatever their legal effective date is, it may not be anywhere near what it is now. And there are different levels of the market as well. Fair market value, retail, which is usually quite a bit higher, and a whole grouping of different levels in between that.
Well, that's good. That's good to know. I think that's very helpful for people to know. They need to make sure the engagement actually properly tracks what their needs are.
Yes.
So we take care of that. Well, there's a lot of information that you share with us, and I wonder if you have some final comments or thoughts you want to share with our viewers about valuing personal property.
Oh, certainly. And thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. For your clients, something that I think is really important to keep in mind is, first, make sure any appraiser that you hire is USPAP compliant. That's critical. And also to recognize that an appraiser can be a real resource in situations where there may be some family discord or some disagreement over how much things are worth. And so having an impartial third party come in with that specialized knowledge to be able to weigh in and say, this is not anywhere near what you think it is, and it's going to be at this level in the market. That can really help provide some peace and settle some problems for families. And also to remember that the market changes dramatically. I find that a lot of clients are working on a concept of the market that is 20 years old, where different object types were performing with much more strength. So it's not always good news, but what I like to do in my firm is try to help empower people to move forward making informed decisions.
And I want to thank you so much, Sarah, for taking the time and come and talk to us today. Great information, very, very valuable, and going to be great helpful to the people of Northern Virginia as they take care of their estates for their loved ones.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Dealing with the division of personal property is, without a doubt, one of the most potentially divisive steps in the probate process for the family of a loved one. Often the will does not detail who is to get what tangible property, but instead allows the children to divide among themselves as they agree. And absent such an agreement, the executor is typically tasked with establishing a process to determine who gets what. One step that may be beneficial for division purposes as well as for probate and tax purposes is to have all the personal property valued by a professional appraiser. And our guest this evening shared valuable information, including what qualifications and licensing to look for in an appraiser, what to expect in the appraisal process, and what an appraisal may cost. Experience is important here, and Sarah was most generous in sharing her expertise with us this evening. We hope you found the discussion helpful. This brings us to the conclusion of our show today on valuation of tangible personal property. Replays of this show, along with other helpful material on the topic of today's show, will be posted on the Probate Nation website. On behalf of myself and the Probate Nation, thank you for visiting with us.